Well, good day. So, our topic this afternoon is teaching Old Testament narrative. Enough of the introductory things, let's get to it. How should we teach Old Testament narrative? God hasn't given us a book of systematic theology. He's given us primarily a storybook. When I was growing up, there was a little Victorian hymn that we used to sing which went like this: God has given us a book full of stories which was made for his people of old. Begins with a tale of a garden and ends with the city of... Very good. You've never heard that before, have you? Now you're a poet and you didn't know it, so there we go. The genre that we're looking at today is the most obviously story-ish bit of the Bible, Old Testament narrative. How should we teach it? That's the question we want to be considering. I guess we're used to the idea of teaching it as children's stories in Sunday school, nice little stories of Smiley Daniels, and for that matter, Smiley lions. The rescue in the night, where the lion seems to become curiously anthropomorphic, or even lion pillowcraft, which is a bizarre idea. Here you are, little darling, lay your head in this nice little lion. Because we all know what lions like to do to little children, don't we? Anyway, what is Old Testament narrative? Well, the first thing to say is that it is a big genre. I'm not quite sure how my PowerPoint is going to go. It's been changed in terms of its format, so we might lose lots of things on the way through, but let's see how we get on. It's a big genre. If I put up here all the books of the Old Testament, of course, that is what we're talking about by Old Testament narrative, all the books that we would immediately think are in the history section of the Bible. But actually, of course, there is Old Testament narrative in lots more places in the Old Testament than just those. So, for example, if we think about the Pentateuch, there is narrative, of course, in Genesis and Exodus. Leviticus less so, although those laws are surrounded by a story of how those laws came from God. Numbers. Deuteronomy gets a kind of pink colour as a sort of ish. And it's kind of story-ish, isn't it? Obviously, then, all the so-called history books. What about the poetry books? Well, Job, not connected to a particular time, but it is a story, isn't it? Psalms, of course, some of those are linked to specific moments in Israel's history. Proverbs, wisdom literature. Ecclesiastes, wisdom literature. Song of Songs, poetry, but of course, it's got elements of narrative in it, isn't it? Major prophets, Isaiah, mostly narrative, but it's got mostly prophecy, but it's got chunks of narrative, hasn't it? Chapters 36, 39. It's like reading 2 Kings. Jeremiah, even more narrative in it than Isaiah, mostly about the prophet's life and ministry. Lamentations, it's poetry, but it's a reaction to a story, to the historic event of Babylon destroying Jerusalem. More of a no, though, in terms of whether it's narrative. Ezekiel, mostly prophecy. Daniel, we're going to spend quite a bit of time in Daniel today. Half of it's narrative, for sure, and the prophecy is intertwined with story bits. Minor prophets, well, I guess Jonah and Haggai most clearly have got a story dominating it, and of course Hosea and Amos are built around a story. In other words, all I'm saying is there is an awful lot of Old Testament. There's a big genre. There's a lot of it. I forgot to say, by the way, there is a handout from today. You'll find that my use of handouts is particularly irritating. The connection between what I say and the handout is kind of hit and miss. So you may or may not find that helpful. There's hardly any Old Testament book, in other words, that has no narrative elements. And even the ones that are entirely prophecy, for example, often have markers like in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. What's that if that's not a story setting? So actually, there are no bits of the Old Testament that are vacuum-packed words spoken into the void. They're all part of a story. So basically, Old Testament narrative that we're thinking about today is a big genre. So we've got to know how to handle it. Now, of course, that is the familiar ordering of the Old Testament books. If we go to the Hebrew ordering, the Tanakh, well, my noddy guide to those sections of the Old Testament are that what we've got in the law, the Pentateuch, are the establishing of God's covenant relationship with his people. The former prophets, what we would call the history books, tell the story of God's people drifting from that covenant, and the latter prophets tell the story of the prophets calling God's people back to that covenant. In other words, they are all story. The plot line of law, former prophets, latter prophets, is story. And of course, the covenant, the writings are applying that covenant to everyday life. So in a sense, you couldn't be much more story-focused than applying the covenant to how we live our lives. We're thinking chiefly about this section of the Old Testament, but of course, as we've seen, there are a lot more places where there is narrative going on. So first question then, what is Old Testament narrative? Answer, it's a big genre. Second thing is that it's part of God's single story. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that it is telling history from God's perspective. We're perhaps used to a diagram similar to this that gives us the plot line of the Old Testament. Standard division that you'll see into the two kingdoms. After the monarchy, the kingdom divides into two, exile, return from exile, etc., etc. But of course, that presentation of the plot line, even if we express it theologically, tells basically a story. So there's lots wrong that you might want to query about this diagram, but as a plot line for the story of the Bible, this is what's going on, isn't it? God's people live in the place of God's blessing. They are exiled from that. And the real return that happens is only when God's people are put back in the new heaven and the new earth, in the place of God's blessing. And all of the mini stories of exile and return are really pointing to that chief story of exile and return. The whole of the Old Testament tells that single story of history from God's perspective, of exile and return. Now, what I mean by this is that every bit of the Old Testament that is telling us the story of an event is, of course, telling us of something that actually happened. Ordinary things and more miraculous things. And, of course, the great thing about stories is that it helps us to get into the nitty-gritty of people's experience, doesn't it? The Old Testament stories are written by people, often the people involved telling the stories of people. But as God's word, what we've got is not just the event, but the explanation of that event. What I mean by that is the explanatio with an N that follows later. I think in the English we pronounce that explanation, but apparently in Australia it's the explanatio with an extra N. So the event plus the explanatio with an extra N, or for friends, shall we call it explanation, just between you and me? We've got the event plus the explanation, and those two things together are what are God's revelation to us. David Chapman, who began the Cornhill training course in London, likes to say that all revelation in the Bible is event plus explanation. And what that means is that God does things and he explains why he does the things that he does. And those two things together are God's revelation of himself. In other words, when we're talking about Old Testament narrative, we don't just mean the event. We mean the event plus God's authorized version of what that event means. He doesn't just do things and leave us to work out why. He doesn't just tell us things without acting in some way. He reveals who he is through what he does. Event plus explanation. That is his revelation to us. So when we're doing Old Testament narrative, expect to find the explanation for the stories that we're looking at. Let me just give you one example. Come to 2 Kings chapter 17. Did you bring a Bible today? Oh, I didn't know I needed a Bible. Yes, you do. 2 Kings chapter 17. Here is the story of Assyria capturing Samaria. Now, there are lots of reasons why you could say that happened. So a stronger nation and a weaker nation, an Assyrian policy of extending their borders and imperialist policy. But verse 7 tells us God's explanation of why it happened. It all occurred because the people of Israel sinned against the Lord their God. There is the explanation of the event. Without verse 7, with just the event, we might come to all kinds of theories as to why it happened. But God gives us his perspective on the events that happened. It is history from God's perspective. Or another example of that, a few thousand people fight a bloke called Og in the desert. Og, remember, is the guy who's got the very big bed at the beginning of Deuteronomy. He has not a king-sized bed or a queen-sized bed, but an Og-sized bed. If you go to the shops, they're 14 foot long, apparently, the Og-sized bed. Who cares that a giant called Og, Humpty Dumpty, Og gets defeated in the desert? Well, interestingly, it comes up again and again in the Old Testament. Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1 Kings, Nehemiah, twice in the Psalms, Og gets mentioned. Interestingly, Goliath only gets mentioned twice in the Old Testament. Og gets a lot more newspaper coverage. And the reason is, and the Old Testament tells us why this story is told to us so often, is that this is not a minor skirmish, but a major war. To the observer, the newspaper reporter, Og might seem fairly small fry, except he's big fry, see what I mean? But to the Old Testament, to God's view of history, he is really significant, because here is the kind of archetypal story that shows God really is with his people, and he is with them as mighty rescuer. So it's an archetypal victory, not just an event of a defeat of a baddie. So what is Old Testament narrative? It's a big genre. It is part of God's single story, and what I mean by that, it is history told from God's perspective, and also, therefore, it is history about Jesus. The process of every bit of the Bible, the revelation that God makes in the Bible, is always leading to the Lord Jesus Christ. That is the goal to which all revelation points. So what Jesus says in Luke 24 is that every bit of the Old Testament, law and prophets and Psalms, points to him. I don't think he means by that you can turn to any verse in the Old Testament and play Spot Jesus. But it does mean that it doesn't matter which bit of the Old Testament you look at, the law, the prophets, or the writings, all of that is pointing towards Jesus. The hero is always God and his Christ. I've given you in your notes a long quotation from a new book by Andrew Reed that helps to explain what is going on in Luke chapter 24, and I've now lost you for the next 15 minutes while you read it. You could read that at another time. You can take that away with you. Of course, there are lots of ways that the Old Testament can be about Christ. So it can be about Christ by directly predicting the Lord Jesus. The virgin will be with child. Unto us a son is born. Government will be on his shoulder. Mighty God. Wonderful Counselor, and so on. But also the Old Testament, through its stories, gives us examples of the type of things God does. I don't know if you heard that definition of typology, but I think it's brilliant. So it comes from Jim Hamilton, a little book called What is Biblical Theology? And he says typology is the type of thing God does. So in other words, the type of thing God does is the Exodus. So not surprisingly, we see echoes of Exodus language all the way through the Bible. For Exodus is the type of thing that God does as Redeemer. There's a little book that's come out recently in the UK called Echoes of Exodus, which describes that idea of that paradigm of the Exodus, how it comes all the way through the Bible. Of course, once you think that the paradigm is basically the people came out, my goodness, you can find people coming out all over the place. Anybody going out of a room? Paradigm of the Exodus, see? Maybe taking it a bit far, but you get the idea. So Jesus' blood is like that of Abel. Why? Well, his blood speaks a better word. Abel's blood calls for vengeance. I guess Abel's blood on the ground is shouting out, Lord, do something about that man because he killed me. He deserves justice, condemnation. Whereas the blood of Jesus calls out a better word. It says, forgiven. This one's forgiven. Jesus is like Noah's ark. When the waters of judgment rise, all who are safe in him are carried through wrath, safe into a new creation. Jesus is like the bronze serpent. Those dying look to him and are restored. Jesus is like Jonah, spending 3 days in the belly of the earth before being spat out alive again, the dead and resurrected prophet who calls sinners to repent. Jesus is like Daniel. He did nothing wrong, but people conspired to have him killed. He's left for dead in a cave. The stone seals the entrance to the cave, but in the morning the mourner returns, the sole mourner, and the stone is rolled away, and God's vindicated servant walks out alive, and so on and so on. Now, we're going to use Daniel as an example, a worked example today. It, too, is about Jesus. It points to him. Let's just clarify where we're up to then. What is Old Testament narrative? It's a big genre. It's part of God's single story. It tells us history from God's perspective. Event plus explanation equals revelation. And it's a single story that is all about Jesus. Here's the question. How does that work? Can I encourage you to read good biblical theology children's books? The one I love particularly is this one that tells the whole story as a story about Jesus. But how do we look for Jesus in the Old Testament narrative? Well, many people think that you do it like playing Where's Wally? Or in America, Where's Waldo? It's all about Jesus, so let's try and find Jesus. Is he under the stone? Is he hidden behind somewhere? So here is the story in Daniel of the 3 men in the fiery furnace. Can you spot Wally? Or here is Daniel in the lion's den. Oh, look, there he is, peeping over the... Much better is to go back to Daniel, back to Babylon, to follow the story and see where Jesus, no, not there, to see where Jesus is in the story and how the whole story is pointing towards him. I think the key first question to ask is, what is the book's melodic line? And what I want to suggest, first of all, and I want to get us straight into the story, is, and you might like to turn to Daniel at this point, I want to suggest, first of all, that Daniel is a story of 2 cities. Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of God, his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Now, it's easy to read those verses out, but of course they are a crisis of everything that the nation stood for. For God had made the Jews his special people, and his promise to them was that they were going to be a great nation in a prosperous land, and it was a promise that God kept as the mighty children of Israel, 2 million plus, walked out of Egypt and into the land that had been promised to them. And we're picking up the story 1,000 years after the Exodus, and that once united nation has now divided into 2. The northern half has been threatened by the world's superpower, Assyria, and it's been carried off into exile. And what happens to that northern kingdom is that it effectively disappears from history. Meanwhile, in the south, the southern kingdom, Judah, enjoys a brief reprieve before the next bully comes along, Babylon, who takes them into exile as well. That's verse 1. And verse 3 following. The land invaded, the best people carried off, including Daniel, this teenager, an undergraduate student, and later all the people will end up being deported and the city destroyed. Daniel is, if you like, crisis literature. In the UK, that's a 999 moment. What number do you call in Australia if there's a crisis? 000. That would have been good to know, wouldn't it? Because I could need that. So Daniel is a triple O moment. How do you make sense of what's going on? Is God any good? He looks about as powerful as jelly. He's just another poor choice in the cafeteria of divine also-rans. That is God. Whereas Babylon, we know they've got pathetic pseudo-gods. We know they're just worshipping carved lumps of lifeless wood, but that is where power most obviously is. The tyrant regime can just pull on its jackboots, march in without so much as a by your leave, and trample all over the people of God. How can you say that God is in charge? It looks as if the same thing is going to happen to the southern kingdom as happened to the northern kingdom. So now see what verse 2 says. Verse 2 says that the way this happened is that God did this. He delivered them over. The Lord gave the king of Judah into the hand of the king of Babylon. This isn't something that happened despite God, against his better judgment. No, this exile is God doing exactly what he said he would. An older preacher that I really admire once said this, that the Bible is written to convince us that God is in charge because we don't really think he is. God had promised things would go well for the nation if it was loyal to God. Things would go badly for the nation if they wandered from him. Covenant blessing for obedience, covenant curse for disobedience. And the rest, as they say, is history. This nation, Judah, was disloyal, and now God did what God said God would do. Exile. He gave them over. Jerusalem falls to Babylon. A tale of two cities. Now, there are lots of ways, of course, of summarizing the storyline of the Bible. How to read it as a single story. It's a single story, and it's not about you. One way of summarizing it is like this, that the single story of the Bible is a story of two cities, Jerusalem and Babylon. Jerusalem is God's holy city. It's where God's people belong. And if we want to see it, we don't need to get out a map and find the place at the eastern end of the Mediterranean that has got a dot and a name beginning with the letter J. We've got to look up. Jerusalem is not here yet, but it's coming, and it is the home to which God will take us. The other city is Babylon, and that's the city where everybody lives. It's the city that represents human depravity. It's a fitting place for people who have kicked God into touch. And here's the point. Babylon is where God's people are. We belong in Jerusalem, but we live currently in Babylon. God's people live here in Babylon, in exile, until the new Jerusalem comes along. We are aliens and strangers, and we can't wait to get home. And I say we deliberately because this is exactly the same thing for us, isn't it? In the UK, this is London. We live in London, but belong in Jerusalem. Here in Australia, we live in Sydney, but we belong in Jerusalem. God's people, far from our heavenly home, living like exiles, like strangers, like aliens in a city that doesn't acknowledge our God. First thing then, a tale of two cities. Second thing, a tale of two realities. And what I mean by that is that Daniel gives us, first of all, the what you see is what you get reality. Look out of your window and tell me what you see. That's real. That is reality. But there's another way of looking at it. There is a heavenly view on it all that describes other things that are going on behind the scenes in the heavenlies. You can't see them, but they are just as real. Now, you'll remember the moment when Jesus was completely changed in front of his disciples, the Transfiguration. 3 of his disciples were given a sneak look, a glimpse behind the curtain. And they get to see that their Jesus is glorious. You couldn't see that, not normally, not when you looked at him, all the time you lived alongside him, not unless somebody gave you a glimpse and let you see it. And in Mark 9, God did. He let those 3 disciples see it. And in Daniel, there is this constant interplay between these 2 realities. What we see in the world all around us, what we experience, touch, and feel, what everybody can see, which is very real to us, of course. And there's also another parallel reality, what we wouldn't see, you wouldn't know by looking, you can only see if somebody draws back the curtain. We've got to be told about it. Just because we can't see it doesn't mean it isn't real. It's very, very real. Now, I think that's what all the dreams are about in Daniel. That God is revealing to his people what you can't see, what you wouldn't know, but is genuine, real reality. That's what all the weird stuff is doing in the book, all the monsters and the battles and the winning and losing. It's God revealing to his people another reality that you can't see, but is very, very real, and we need to know it. Looking again down to the first 2 verses of the book of Daniel. Verse 1 tells us that what you see is what you get reality. Jerusalem overtaken by Babylon, God's people defeated by the power of a superpower. Verse 2 reveals a hidden reality, that it's God who did it. He gave Jehoiakim into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Which is real, verse 1 or verse 2? Answer, yeah, that's right, they both are. Both realities alongside one another. It's the same thing in chapter 9. Flick forward there. Chapter 9, verse 1. What we're told in chapter 9, verse 1, is the story from the end of Daniel chapter 5. The story of how one dynasty ended, the Babylonian dynasty, and another empire became top dog, the Persian, the Median Empire. Happened in 539 BC, a real day in history. It's in the history books. You can go to room 55 in the British Museum, and there it all is. So look at verse 1. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, by descent to Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. Verse 2 now tells us a different reality. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. This is a reality that is written in the Old Testament, revealed by God to Jeremiah, who wrote it up for us. You wouldn't know about the 70 years unless God had revealed it. And what verse 2 tells us is the events of verse 1 were all written up on God's wall calendar long before they started. Yes, then there'll be 70 years. I've got this one covered. Another example, chapter 10, verses 2 to 3. Look forward to this. So chapter 10, verses 2 to 3 recount the story of Daniel's praying in chapter 9. And it describes, verse 2, that in those days, the Daniel chapter 9 days, I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the 3 full weeks. So here is the situation. Daniel is in mourning. He's on a subsistence level diet, no deodorant or shower gel for 3 weeks. He's pleading with God to act on behalf of his people for 3 weeks, and nothing happened. Now, what's that like for Daniel? Well, presumably he's thinking, why hasn't God answered my prayer? What's the problem? Why the delay for 3 weeks? Well, here's the explanation that he's given. Chapter 10, verse 12. A heavenly being appears to Daniel and said to him, verse 12, fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before God, your words have been heard, and I've come because of your words. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia, and came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days. For the vision is for days yet to come. And the picture is this: the prince of the kingdom of Persia, some kind of angelic being, an evil, demonic power, here in these verses, is opposing Michael and the angelic man who is speaking. Some powerful evil spirit working through Persia to harm God's people. And what is now being revealed to Daniel is that there's been some conflict in the heavenlies, in some other realm of reality that we can't see. It's not less real because we can't see it. It's actually a very, very real experience that these evil powers are influencing, controlling the kingdoms and governments of this world. And they're doing it in order to inflict harm and havoc onto the people of God. So a tale then of two realities. God's people live in the world we can see, and they hold firm to the reality of the world that God reveals to us. See where I'm going with this? We live by faith, not just by sight. Third thing, that Daniel is a tale told in two languages. Now, at the obvious level, there is, the book divides into two, chapters 1 to 6, the history bit, and chapter 7 to 12, what we call the apocalyptic. Or to be clearer, chapter 1 to 6, the easy bit, chapters 7 to 12, the weird bit. Now, just turn to chapter 2, verse 4, where the Chaldeans speak to the king in Aramaic, chapter 2, verse 4, little footnote. The text from this point to the end of chapter 7 is in Aramaic. So this is the way that the book is written out. The first bit in Hebrew, the second bit in Aramaic, then we come back in chapter 8 to the end in Hebrew. What's the significance of that? Well, these languages are the language of God's people and the language of all the world. Hebrew is the language of God's people. Aramaic is the common language of the Persian period, the lingua franca, just like English is today. I mean, we basically think you'll speak English if you want me to understand you. And if you don't speak English, well, obviously you're not very educated. And that's exactly the same, isn't it? Areas of international life now, the same then. It was Aramaic that was that language. Now, take those two languages and map them onto these two realities. What have we got? Well, we've got, in the first bit, a glimpse behind, and in the middle bit, that what you see is what you get reality, and again, in the last bit, a glimpse behind. Or to be clearer, we've got what God says and what we see. These two realities are told for his people in the world. That still doesn't explain why it's written in two languages. So come back to chapter 1, verse 2, and look again at where this story of Daniel all takes place. Chapter 1, verse 2, where does it take place? I've kept saying Babylon all the way through, but it actually says it takes place where? Hello? Thank you. Good. Now, it gets rarely mentioned in the Bibles, but one place where Shinar is mentioned that is very significant is in Genesis chapter 11, verse 2. Let's flick back there. Genesis 11, verse 2. And, of course, you'll realize as soon as we turn there, the context for Genesis 11 is chapters 1 to 3. And the effect of Genesis 1 to 3 spreading through the entire world. The spread of wickedness, the spread of death, and chapter 11 tells us about that spread. The geographical spread that chapter 10 describes. How did that happen? Well, chapter 11 tells us, and the story begins in verses 3 and 4, where we can see human rebellion in all its ugliness. You've just got to read the minutes of the planning department. Verse 4, the people of Shinar said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." Now you'll see that in verse 4 there are 4 clauses. And they fit together like this. The first and the fourth clause go together. Let us build ourselves a city, first clause. Why? because we don't want to be dispersed over the face of the earth. And the second and the third clauses go together. Let's build a tower with its top in the heavens in order to make a name for ourselves. Now, what is wrong with those two things that they are doing? Well, there are two problems, and they're exactly the same problems as in the garden. So what they do, first of all, is defy God's word, because God had told them not to be gathered, but to spread. So chapter 9, verse 1, they are to fill the earth. Chapter 9, verse 7, they are to teem all over the earth. It echoes the language of chapter 1, verses 27 and 28. Go into all the earth and fill it. But they said, no, I don't think we'll do that. We won't do what you say. And the second thing that is wrong with what they do is that they defy God's rule. Making a name for yourself is all about brand recognition, isn't it? It's about fame. We want McDonald's, the golden arches, to be known all around the world or whatever. We want people to know who we are. We want to be impressed. We want people to treat us as the big boys in town. And the way that people will do that is if I can build a bigger tower than you. So in London, we're terribly, terribly proud of our Shard, because it's the biggest building in Europe. So we're saying to Europe in these days of Brexit, we're better than you. How do you know? Look at our tower. So verse 4 is about human sin at its most blatant, its most brazen insolence. It's a corporate rebellion, just like Genesis 3 is an individual rebellion. Here is deja vu all over again. If you wanted a smoking gun, here it is. Indisputable evidence of a world desperate to have nothing to do with its creator. We know better. We're going to gather together, find our own society. We're going to be great. We're going to rule. This is Psalm 2 territory, isn't it? An attempt to find a new world center, to order the world without reference to the creator. Well, and then we get to verse 5. And verse 5 gives us the Lord's perspective on the entire thing. This is the turning point in the story. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. Now, remember, these guys are building a tower with its top in the heavens, and the Lord, verse 5, has to do what? Come down to see it. What is that? Would you come and look at this? Oh, bless them. Look at that tiny little tower. Wow, that's a really big tower. God is saying, let's go and see what those tiny little earthlings have done. Wow, you built a little model sundial in your back garden. Yeah, I made time. And so God decides to hinder their rise, because a monolithic anti-Christian state is very frightening. All for one and one for all is an inspiring slogan for an adventure tale, but take it to the Nuremberg rallies and it is frightening. So they say in verse 3, let's mix up stuff to make bricks. And God says in verse 7, using exactly the same word, let's mix up their language. Now, what's the significance of this? Well, the place gets called Babel, or the Americans say Babel. Babelton. Babylon. Exactly. So Babel, Babylon, stands for two things. First of all, it represents a rebellion against God and his rule. An attempt to order the world, one common set of values, one language, one list of approved deities, one national educational curriculum. Unity, oneness. And Nebuchadnezzar represents, in Daniel chapter 1, a deliberate reviver of the Babel policy. In Shinar, there he is doing exactly that. Rebellion, that's what it stands for. But of course, they wanted a name in verse 4, so God gives them a name in verse 9, Babel. They didn't want to be dispersed in verse 4, and so God disperses them. That's his punishment. He scatters them. So actually, of course, his word and his rule are supreme. and his purpose to spread people continues. So that's the first thing Babylon represents rebellion. But also, ironically, this place that stands to represent oneness also represents confusion, mixedy-muddledness, where confusion is the result of God's judgment. And that confusion is expressed, verse 9, in languages. So we cannot understand each other. The United Nations, our contemporary version of bringing all the nations of the world together because together we can solve the world's problems. And every photo you see of the United Nations, everybody's wearing earphones. Why? Because nobody can understand each other. I mean, we can't understand the Americans. We're two nations divided by a common language. We've got the same language, we don't speak the same language. Now, here's my question. Is that why Daniel is in two languages? It's unique in the Old Testament. There are other books of the Bible, like Ezra, that have got some bits of other language in them, but a book that is so clearly divided into two languages like that, it's almost as if this is to telegraph something significant that is going on here in the land of Shinar. Ding, 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 ding. Ring any bells? Shinar languages. So we've got two things going alongside one another here. God is revealing stuff so we can make sense of the world in which we live in a world which is all confusion, which needs what God reveals if we're going to ever make sense of it all. So into the Babylonian court, God speaks from the heavenly court. And God reveals himself so that people who are under his judgment in confusion and can understand nothing, God reveals himself so that his people can understand what is going on. So again and again, the nations of the world have to come to God's people and say, explain to me what's going on, as Nebuchadnezzar does, as Belshazzar does. So just before we come to look in a bit more detail, let's get a bit of a feel for the way that these sections then are set out. So in this section of chapters 2 to 7, and I see the formatting is rather messed up, so the pink saying Aramaic should finish bang on the black line. So the Aramaic section has got the chapters 2 to 7, which pair up like this. Chapter 2 and chapter 7 match one another. They both tell the stories of a sequence of 4 kingdoms. So in chapter 2, it is 4 sections of a statue. In chapter 7, it is 4 beasts that come out of the sea, but 4 kingdoms that are then defeated by the kingdom that God establishes and will last forever. In chapter 2, a rock rolling down the hillside. In chapter 7, thrones of judgment that are set up, and the Son of Man raised and given a kingdom forever. Chapters 3 and 6 fit together as stories of opposition and God's people being in chains. So in chapter 3, the opposition is expressed in terms of fire. In chapter 6, the opposition is expressed in terms of lions. But in both cases, it is the anti-God state oppressing God's people. And both those chapters then tell of God's rescue. And chapters 4 and 5 fit together as the story of 2 kings who are humbled. So Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4 and Belshazzar in chapter 5. And then in the second half of the book, in the Hebrew section, we have 4 visions that are given to Daniel for God's people to explain the world of chapters 2 to 7 in which they live. Now, of course, going back to that chiasm in the first half, what that means is that chapter 4 and 5 are right at the center of the Aramaic section, and the verse that is right at the heart of the book then is chapter 4, verse 37. Let's just turn there. Daniel chapter 4, verse 37. We're at the end of the humbling of Nebuchadnezzar, who humbles himself before the King of Heaven and is then raised back to his position of authority. And before the story of King Belshazzar, he's also humbled but refuses the humbling warning of God. Right in the middle comes the key verse, those who walk in pride, God, the King of heaven, he is able to humble. Now, it's possible that chapters 2 and to 7 were intended, which is why they're written in Aramaic, were intended for the Persian world, almost as an evangelistic tract to the nations of the world, to say, humble yourself before Israel's king, who is the King of heaven. Now, the message of the world in which we live is this, that we live in a world of powerful kings and God's people are in chains. So the kings can be presented as monsters. They are very, very powerful and aggressive and destructive. And God's people's experience, the experience of God's people in this world under kings like that, is that we are in chains. But the reality that God reveals to his people is this, that there is a king who is coming who will reign forever. And when God puts his king on the throne, God's people will swap their chains for crowns and share in his rule. So the message of the what you see is what you get world is powerful kings who oppose God's people oppressed and in chains. And what God reveals is there is a king who will reign forever, and God's people will swap their chains for crowns and share in his rule. Now, coming back to where we began this big section, we're thinking, how do we preach Old Testament narrative? The first thing is to get clear on what the melodic line of the book is. That's a bit of language that we use a lot in Cornhill to say, just as with a symphony, there may be a melody that comes in and out, but when it comes back, you recognize that melody again. Oh, that's the main theme tune. In the same, what is the theme tune that comes up again and again through this book? It's developed, slightly changed. It comes back in the minor key. It comes back inverted, but there it is again. What is that theme running through the book? And that's the first question. That's what we've tried to look at in Daniel. Second question then, as we think about how to preach Old Testament narrative, is what is the book's purpose? I'm going to spend less time on this, and then there'll be a chance for 10 minutes questions before we go to tea. So what I mean by what is the book's purpose is who was the book written for and why. When the author of any Bible book took pen in hand and started to write, what was his reason for doing that? Now, one of the phrases we've started using increasingly in Cornhill in London to try and bring out this sense of what we're looking for here, the purpose or the aim or the reason, is the phrase pastoral intention. So Daniel or whoever is writing as a pastor. He's got a pastoral concern, a pastoral heart for those he's writing for. What is his intention for the people who are under his care, for whom he is writing? Or to put it another way, what is his prayer for them? He's writing and praying what? What is he asking God for them? So we want to think about what the aim is of what we're reading. Let me just go back one. First of all then, thinking about the people who were living then alongside Daniel. For those who were living through the experience that Daniel was living through, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and their mates. I mean, how would this message of this book feel if you were with Daniel, living in that sequence of kings and kingdoms, monstrous rulers, kings who are putting God's people in chains? How would it feel? Well, you're in exile, you're under the cosh, you're chained up in Babylon. You feel that the monstrous Nebuchadnezzar is like the kind of iron-teethed monster of Daniel 7. You feel he's strong. You feel he's stamping all over you, this monster. Now think what you would feel as you see in this vision what God reveals. What is promised to Jesus and therefore what is promised to you. That there is an eternal king with an everlasting kingdom who's going to smash Nebuchadnezzar and all like him out of the way and establish the kingdom of King Jesus forever as the only kingdom. And you can share in it. Your chains are going to be taken and you're going to be given crowns. That's what the future looks like for you, according to what God reveals, from the glimpse of the hidden reality revealed into your reality. I mean, wow. Now who's as powerful as jelly? Wow. But I want us to ask a second question, and that is, what is the book's purpose for those who are reading this story? What I mean by that is, for whom did Daniel write? Did Daniel write for the people who were going through this experience in Babylon with him, or for somebody else? Well, turn back to Daniel chapter 1, verse 21, and tell me when Daniel wrote. Sorry, I'm just doing up my shoelace because I keep tripping over it up here, losing my balance. Daniel 1:21. When did Daniel write? I'm waiting.
Was it after the return from...
Good. What makes you think it might be after the return?
Well, he remained there until the first year of King Cyrus, which was the year that he gave the decree that the captives would return.
Yes. So he must be writing after the first year of King Cyrus, or in the first year of King Cyrus, is the absolute earliest he could have been writing. Absolutely. And Cyrus, of course, is the king who gave the command at the end of 2 Chronicles, the start of Ezra, that God's people who are in exile may return. So we've been thinking about the people who are in exile, thinking, might our experience be the same as the northern kingdom's experience when they went to Assyria? Might we be wiped out? Might we be airbrushed out of history? Is that our future? What is the future for the people of God? Well, Daniel, it's clear in chapter 9, had the expectation of return from Babylon and wrote after the return from Babylon, from hindsight. So those reading this story are reading it after God's people have returned from exile. Now, you'll remember from Jeremiah that the message to God's people as they go into exile is you're going to be there for a bit of time, 70 years, as we know. So it's okay for you to settle down whilst you're in Babylon. But don't settle down, because you're not staying there forever. And it's okay for you to build houses. You're going to live there long enough that you don't have to carry on living in tents. You haven't got to have 70 years of camping holidays. You can build a house. And in your garden, you can plant perennials that will come up each year, because you're going to be there for long enough. It's okay for you to seek the prosperity of the city that you're going to live in, because you're going to be there for long enough to make that worthwhile. So settle down there, enjoy. Don't you dare settle down there, because you're coming back from there. Now, what then is Daniel's message to people who have come back? Well, the message is, you've returned from exile and now you live in exile. You're no longer in Babylon because you've come back to Jerusalem, so now you're waiting to go back to Jerusalem. Or to put it even more complicatedly, you were in Babylon, you've come back to Jerusalem, so now you live in Babylon until you get back to Jerusalem. Just leaving a moment for the logic of that to make any sense whatsoever. You see, God's purposes continue far beyond Judah and those 70 years in Babylon. God's purposes continue far beyond that 70-year period. In fact, the revelation that Daniel gets in chapter 7 is, yeah, you're going to go back after 70 years. Yeah, you'll rebuild the temple, you'll rebuild the city. Oh, and then the temple and the city will be destroyed again. Because as far as Daniel can think, is 70 years ahead. But in fact, God's purposes continue for eternity, and God's people remain in exile. We still live in a world where monsters rule, And we still lead the message that there is a king who is coming who will be established and reign forever and ever. Let me turn you to 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, as I finish this section. 1 Peter 5, 13. So here is Peter writing from Rome to Christians who are scattered throughout Asia. They're on the run ever since the dispersion of Acts 8. So the persecution that has led God's people to be dispersed, scattered. Peter is writing to the scattered people of God, far away from their homeland, and he's writing from Rome. And as you know, chapter 5, verse 12 is very clear why he's writing. He's writing, exhorting and declaring what the true grace of God is so that God's people stand firm in it. It's the next verse I want us to look at, chapter 5, verse 13, where Peter sends greetings from the church in Rome. She who is at, New Testament term to describe the church. And Peter says, you know how you're all scattered all over the place and you long to get back home? Well, she who is at home in Rome actually is she who is at Babylon. And because we've got biblical theology, that word rings massive bells to us. Peter is saying that God's people who are at home are in exile. They're in Rome, but in Babylon. So that is exactly our position, for that is the position of all God's people who remain in exile until we go home. The message of Daniel is something we need because we are in Babylon waiting to go back to Jerusalem, the two cities. We need the revelation of the reality we can't see to help us live in the reality that we see all around us. We need what God speaks to us to equip us to live in the world that we see. So here we are then, that Daniel and his mates are exiles. Obviously, they're in Babylon. But here is the significant thing. Daniel's readers back in Jerusalem are similarly exiles. Peter says we are exiles too. God's people remain exiled from our true inheritance, from our heavenly home. We're not there yet. So we need what Daniel says. And what Daniel equips us to do is to walk in this world in the light of these two realities. Here are the two realities all around us, what we see and what God speaks into our world. And he speaks, he reveals things to equip us to live by the truth of what he says, by faith, by trusting that's going to be, as we walk by sight, which of course we do, everything that is all around us. So it's a great message that what we've got in Daniel is, and we've thought here about the melodic line and the purpose, that Daniel is writing to equip God's people then to live in this world in exile until we get home.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to you. We're going to begin in just a moment. I'll invite you just to find your seats, and I'm sure there'll be a few more people trickling in. Just a few things that I'd like to announce to you right now. One thing is that the second half of what we do with the John Chapman Initiative is take people away for retreats. And we call these the John Chapman Preaching Clinics. What they are 3-day retreats. We go away for 2 nights, 3 days. And we bring men and women that are involved in various forms of word ministry to get some input about preaching a particular section. It might be preaching Daniel, and we might work through Daniel in 5 or 6 sessions. And we'll get a lot of information that will help us think through how we might preach and teach through those sections in our own ministries. So people leave with a lot of resources that they can use in their own ministries. But also, we give people a chance for feedback on their own proclamation. And so they bring the last talk that they gave, in whatever context that was, and they deliver that talk to a small cohort of people for feedback on the day. And they are participating in giving feedback to others as well in these peer groups. I have found this to be one of the most beneficial things I've ever been to as a minister. I love these retreats. They're probably one of my favorite couple of days in the year. This year, because we sold out last time, we're running 2 back-to-back. So you have a chance to come away. My recommendation to you is that you come and maybe bring a friend in ministry, bring somebody else on a staff team if you have somebody else with you on your team. Bring some things that you will be equipped. It's also a time to be refreshed. And so we have lots of time built in for a lot of good food, some rest, some R&R, but a lot of good input as well to keep you going in the work that you're doing. So those will be running September 7th to the 11th this year, 7th to the 11th down the South Coast. And more information will be available come later this month, and we'll open up registrations then. But just save the date is what we're announcing today, 7th to the 11th of September. Without anything else, Nigel, we'll welcome you back up, and we'll look forward to hearing from you.
Can I just underline what Chase is saying about the value of that small preaching group where you preach and then get feedback? That's the bread and butter of what we do at Cornhill. So we have about 1,300 student sermons given in the course of a year. So we listen to and give feedback on 1,300 student sermons, give written feedback afterwards as well as the group discussion. And that is the bread and butter of how we train people to preach, actually, by getting them trying again, and getting feedback and growing in the habits, in the right kind of instincts, in the ability to have a go, try it out, try a different way of doing it. We encourage people to experiment, to grow as a preacher. Good, let's go back then to where we finished. I've changed my PowerPoint, so I've now got my formatting, so I think this is going to work. So what have we thought about so far? We've thought about what Old Testament narrative is. It's a big genre, and it's part of God's single story. And we've thought about 2 answers to the question, or 2 ways of thinking about how to preach Old Testament narrative. So first of all, to think about what is the book's melodic line, and secondly, to think about the book's purpose, why it is written, so the what and the why. We thought about that in terms of Daniel. I've described Daniel as a tale of 2 cities, 2 realities, and in 2 languages. So this session, we're going to think much more about the practicalities, the how to preach Old Testament narrative. So I'm going to start with some how not to's. So how not to preach Old Testament narrative. Here we go. First one, history lectures. Don't make it dull and dry and detached. For sure, show people a map if you really have to, and it's going to help. For sure, draw a family tree if it matters for the point that you're making. Tell them when it happened if they need to know that. But much more important than the number of the year, 567 BC or whatever it might be, is where it comes in the story. So don't let it become dry and dull and detached. Give them enough context so people know where we are. But get to the point. So we are not providing historical background information. That is not the pulpit. That's not what the pulpit's for. So only give what is necessary to get to the point. Beware preaching Old Testament narrative as history lectures. Can I say lots of conservative churches do this? Nobody dares to nod, but it is true. Second thing, because you're sitting next to your senior minister and you're thinking, yeah, he does all the time. Tell me about it. Second, how not to, fables with a moral. Some stories do indeed work as examples, but that's not all they are. Don't do character studies. Don't make the application dare to be a Daniel. Show us a big God who saves, who makes promises and keeps them, a God worth following, as Daniel did. Can I say lots of liberal churches do this? Oh, you'll nod about that one. Oh, yeah, they do. They're terrible. And conservative churches do this, who know that their legalistic members like application. It's a good shortcut to application, isn't it? Third thing, don't preach Old Testament narrative as allegory. The great thing about Google is that you can always find bad examples of everything online, can't you? It's great. Here is a bad example of how to preach Old Testament narrative. So it's the well-known story of David and Goliath. Why is it that the 5 stones that David picked up, we were told, are smooth? Words very relevant to us all today, I'm sure. But why is it that we're told that they are smooth? Well, according to this, it's because these 5 smooth gospel stones represent tried and tested, proven personal habits that David possessed, by which he was able to defeat Goliath. And if we acquire these 5 smooth gospel habits, then we too will conquer our personal Goliaths. The 5 are, just in case you're wondering that you need to smooth them down: faith, obedience, service, prayer, and the gift of the Holy Spirit, which you're all thinking, yeah, that was my sermon last week. That's right. So don't turn Old Testament narrative into allegory. And the 4th thing is, don't preach Jewish sermons, which I think is a mixture of the first 2. Lots of historical context applied to being moral. So people are truly called back to the Lord, as Isaiah was doing, but the name of Jesus isn't mentioned. So the arrival of Jesus changes everything, so put all your sermons through the synagogue test. If I went down to the nearest Hebrew congregation, our local synagogue, and preached the sermon, would they kick me out? Or would they say, "Thank you, Rabbi, very nice"? Aim to get kicked out of the synagogue, and bring all the newly converted Messianic Jews with you. That's the not tos. How to then? So we've already thought about 2 ways on the how to, and I don't apologize for concentrating so much on the big view of the book, the why it's written, and what it's basically about, getting those things clear. Those are absolutely essential before you come to what we're going to spend time thinking about this session. So please don't go away thinking, aha, this second session, this is the silver bullet. If I do this, it's going to solve the problem. There's no shortcut to the hard work on the whole book, what it's about and why it's there. But here is my heading for this little bit, and that is that stories have a shape. What I mean by that is that we are used to all stories in our Western tradition having a shape that tends to go building up like that towards a climax at the end. So think of the story of the 3 little pigs. So the first little pig building his house, wanting to escape from the big bad wolf, building his house of whatever it is, straw. The little pig coming, the wolf coming, "I'm going to blow your house down." No, not by the hairs of my chinny chin, then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down. He does. We go on to the second. Sticks, same thing happened. Little pig, let me in. No, not by the hairs of my chinny chin. And I'll huff and I'll puff, I'll blow your house down. Third, we're building to the climax. What will happen at the 3rd little pig's house? Now, I'm trusting that this story is not unfamiliar to you. Please, somebody nod. Thank you. I used this example at Cornhill, and right at the beginning of the year, and some of the international students who were there were going around for the whole of the year saying, "What is this 3 little pigs story in the Bible? Is this the secret to understanding the Bible? Where are these pigs in the Bible?" But we're used to a story that builds up to a climax. So that the 3 little pigs story, I deliberately use that because that is a classic story. First, second, what will happen in the next one? That is the way the story is working, building up through repetition to the climax. Now, of course, as we know, in much Hebrew storytelling, the story builds to a climax in the middle, where the first and the last bits match one another, the second and the next to last match one another, the third and the third from the end match one another, and the climax is right in the middle. I say climax, but I wonder if that's an unhelpful word to use for that. Whereas in our storytelling, in our Western tradition, the climax comes at the end, I wonder if rather than saying in Hebrew storytelling, in a chiastic structure, the climax comes in the middle, it's better to think of that midpoint as the turning point. So what happens is we go up the mountain and back down the other side. And where we turn from going up the mountain to start going down the mountain, that midpoint is the turning point. We change direction from up to down. So that is the route. And that turning point right in the middle is, I think, it provides for us the teaching point of the story. So the story turns at that point, and the place at which the story turns is the thing that the story is teaching to us. Let's turn to Exodus. This is the one example we're going to use at this point that's outside Daniel. Let's come to Exodus chapters 1 and 2. Now, I'm just going to I've divided Exodus 1 and 2 into 6 bits. I've chunked up this passage, so read it, chunk it. First task, to chunk up the passage. I've chunked it up into these 6 sections. Just glance through it, seeing these verses, and see how I've chunked it up and why I've put it into those sections. Just so you get familiar. Don't read it, but just glance through it so you're seeing what the plot of Exodus 1 and 2 is. Okay, so we've got something that's like this. The beginning and the end match. So we've got the story so far introduced in verses 1 to 7. It's kind of a recap of Genesis, how in God's covenant promises and in fulfillment of his promises, one man has grown to 12, to 70, to verse 7, a fruitful and increased greatly nation, so that the land was filled with them. Do you know what the collective noun for people is? So, collective noun for sheep, a flock of sheep, herd of cattle. Collective noun for people, according to verse 7, is a landfill. So we've got a landfill of people in fulfillment of God's promises. And right at the end of chapter 2, to balance that, we've got reference back to the covenant promises of God, setting up where the story is going to go. Now, between that, we've then got 2 stories about Pharaoh and 2 stories about Moses. Pharaoh oppresses Israel, takes away the materials and makes them work harder, makes them work ruthlessly as slaves. And 15 following, he kills the Israelite babies there to be thrown into the Nile. First of all, by midwives aren't to let them live, and if they're boys, and secondly, throwing them into the Nile. And then Moses in the basket, verses 1 to 10, or actually, as you know, Moses in the ark. It's a story of Moses being rescued by being put in an ark. It's the same word as Noah's ark. Sorry to all those people who've been making a living out of producing Moses baskets. They should have been Moses arks that he was put in, for this is a rescue story like Noah. And then verses 11 to 22, a story of Moses killing the Egyptian and then running. So, just to be clear, what we've got then, an introduction, a beginning and end, introduction to the book, an introduction to the continuing story, Pharaoh, Moses, Moses. Now, 2 stories then about Pharaoh, 2 stories about Moses. Now, the interesting thing as you look at those 2 stories of Pharaoh and Moses, the stories of Pharaoh are Pharaoh oppressing in terms of work. So the oppression of the people of Israel is the work. So he makes their work harder. And then we get story of Moses oppressing in terms of killing by means of water. Then we get a story of Moses rescued from death through water, being drawn out of water. And we get a story of Moses rescuing people twice from a situation of oppression to do with work. Now, you can see you've got an intro, and then you've got an ABBA. So, turning point you'd expect to be right in the middle, as indeed it is. So the turning point comes at the beginning of chapter 2, up the mountain and back down the other side. What is the turning point? The turning point, chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, is a son is born. That's the thing that changes the narrative, changes the story. So oppression, rescue. What changes a story of oppression to a story of rescue? A son is born. And of course, the significance of Moses, the son being born, is that the stories we get of Moses rescuing are actually the stories of the rescuer being rescued. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but key thing is that if you know Exodus 2, you know all the key words that are used of Moses' rescue exactly foretell the story of the rescue of the people of Israel. So we've got the same idea of saw as God saw, the same idea of Moses striking as God struck, thank you. The same idea of Moses delivering, saving, just as God will deliver and save. The same idea of Moses watering the flock. The same idea of Moses then dwelling, exactly as God will dwell with his people. So the key thing is the turning point at the beginning of chapter 2 that sets up the rescue story. The rescuer is born. And by the way, this rescuer must first be rescued before he can be the deliverer of his people. Now, my point here simply then is that all stories have a structure, and we're looking for what is the structure of this story. So is it building to a climax? Has it got a teaching point at a turning point in the middle of the story or somewhere else? Let's take Daniel chapter 2, and you've got this written somewhere on your handout, I think. Have you got this somewhere? You've got a diagram. If you haven't, it would have been very useful if I put it on there, but I think it is there somewhere. Okay, good, thank you. So what is the structure in Daniel chapter 2? Well, I think what we've got is a structure, a chiasm structure. So we've got at the beginning, in fact, let's turn to Daniel 2. It'll be helpful to have your Bibles open. So if you've got your Bibles open and the piece of paper with my structure on it and this diagram on the screen, we're set up. Okay. So what we've got at the beginning of the chapter is Nebuchadnezzar has had a dream, and it is unexplained, and he's troubled by it. And if you look down to verse 31, what we have there is Daniel giving the interpretation of the dream to Nebuchadnezzar. What we're told in verses 2 to 11 is that nobody can explain the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has had. So the Chaldeans are called in, all the experts, the dream experts come and explain the dream, and they can't do it. Partly because they say, tell us what the dream is and we'll explain it. And Nebuchadnezzar says, you're not catching me out that way. I'm not telling you what the dream is. You tell me what the dream is and you tell me what the dream means. And they say, well, we can't do that. You tell us what the dream means and we'll tell us, no, absolutely not. Off with your heads, he says. Can't do it. Kill a lot of you. But they say, look at the verse 11, which is a very revealing moment. They say, the thing the king asks is difficult, you're telling me. No one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. Now, look what they're saying there. None of us, we can't tell you the thing you can't understand that has been revealed to you in a dream. And the only person who could do that are the gods. And where are gods when you need them? They're nowhere around. That's what they're saying. Compare that within verse 25 to 31, where Daniel comes before the king. And Daniel, remember, is the revealer of dreams. And he stands in front of the king, and the king says, verse 26, are you able to make known to me the dream that I've seen and its interpretation? And Daniel said, yes, of course. Except he doesn't. He says, no, I can't. But, verse 28, and see how this exactly matches that desperate verse 11. Nobody can reveal it to the king. Verse 28, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he's made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dreams and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. So nobody can reveal except the gods, and they're not around. God reveals, not me, but God reveals. Third step, that Nebuchadnezzar says in 12 to 18, right, that's it, death to the wise men. And that mirrors, I think, verses 19 to 21, where Daniel praises God who has revealed things. The wise men can't reveal things, so kill them off. God has revealed things, so praise to him. Verse 20, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons, he removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness. So the turning point, of course, right in the middle is verse 19, where the mystery was revealed to Daniel. That is the turning point in the story. An unexplained dream that nobody can reveal. Kill the wise men because they're useless. Turning point. God brings revelation. So, praise to him, for God reveals, I can explain the dream. So here we go then. We've got up the mountain, down the other side, and a turning point right in the middle. Now, that's the diagram that I've given to you. Here's my question. I want you to discuss this with your neighbour. So looking at my little diagram there, looking at the way I described it, here's the question. Do you think the point of Daniel chapter 2 is the fact that God reveals? Namely, that turning point, verse 19. That's the key thing of chapter 19, the fact that God reveals. Or do you think the key point of Daniel chapter 2 is what God reveals from verse 31 following? You clear what the question is? Is the main point that God reveals, or is the main point the stuff that is revealed in the dream? Talk to your neighbour and reach a conclusion between you. This involves words and speaking. Okay, let's come back together again. Let's come back together again. Have you reached a conclusion? You need to settle in your mind which one of those two is correct. So you need to settle in your mind whether you think the main point of the passage is from this turning point in verse 19, the fact that God is the revealer of mysteries, or whether you think that the main point of the passage is not that, but what is revealed in verse 31 following. So you've got to vote one way or the other. You can't not put your hand up. You're not allowed to not play my game. You've come to my seminar, you play my game by my rules. So put your hand up if you think the main point is that God reveals. Put your hand up if you think the main point is what God reveals. Put your hand up if you haven't put your hand up. No pressure. Now, I think one way of thinking about the shape of stories is to realize that you go up the mountain, back down the other side to get to the cafe. What I mean by that is there is a turning point in the story, but that is not necessarily the destination of the story. So the story turns, but it turns to take you where? So in Exodus chapter 1 and 2, the story turns at the fact that the son is born in order to take you to see that this is the rescuer who must be rescued, whom God will use to rescue his people. So the story turns in order for where the cafe, what the cafe is going to be. And I think in our passage, for those of you who thought it's both, it's kind of a both, I think. So the turning point is Daniel 2:19. The fact that God reveals changes the story. The whole story turns on the fact that God reveals. If he hadn't revealed, there's no story. So that's the shape of the story. Can't, he does. The end result of that is what God ends up revealing. So the story needs verse 31 to finish, doesn't it? You couldn't finish the story at verse 30. So the cafe, if you like, at the end of the story, is the stuff that God reveals. That he reveals, what he reveals. So he reveals this stuff. So for those who are both, great, be an Anglican. Anglicans always both. So my headings for this passage are that this passage is about the God who reveals, and he reveals that kingdoms come and go, and that he will set up his forever kingdom. So that, I think, is the flow of the chapter. God reveals, and what does he reveal? The kingdoms come and go, and that he will set up his forever kingdom. Now, what we're thinking about is the fact that as we come to preach Old Testament narratives, stories have a shape. And all I've simply wanted to do so far is demonstrate that there is some sense of shape in a story, flow, direction, turning point, change of angle, because of this, then that. And what I want us to now do is spend some time thinking a bit more about how to identify the shape of a story. And I want to use, to help us with this, the work of a non-Christian writer called Kurt Vonnegut, who has analysed stories and said there are only a few different stories and you can draw them. And I've developed that to produce this thing that I hope will be useful to you. I call it story graphing. So we're going to do some story graphs to help us work on the shape of stories. And you've got lots of little boxes that are blank that you can have fun drawing in now as I explain them to you. So it goes like this. You draw, first of all, a vertical axis, a GI axis from good fortune to ill fortune. In other words, how the story is going. Is it good or bad? In terms of what the feel of the story is, how it feels as a reader as we read it, what we're meant to be thinking, oh, this is good, or oh, this is bad. And then a horizontal axis that takes the story from beginning to end, and if you like, across the middle is a kind of an average line. Now, what we're going to do is look at some story shapes. You're going to love this because it's got moving parts on the screen. So don't be looking down and miss the moving parts. Okay, all right. So the first story that we're going to think about is called Man in a Hole. So it starts off with a man who's doing fine. Things go badly for him. He gets out of that bad situation, and it ends up better than before. Man in a hole. Man starts good, goes bad, he gets out better than before. You may draw that now. That's the end of the moving parts for this little bit. So man in a hole. Doesn't have to be a man, doesn't have to be a hole. Here's the second one. So the second one is called Boy Meets Girl. So it starts average, just an ordinary day, and something amazing happens. But there is a threat underneath it, and it's all then in jeopardy before it all ends up resolved and happy. This is the plot of every romantic comedy movie. This is the rom-com story. Boy meets girl. So meets, everything's good, but something threatens it all, and then it all ends up brilliant by the end. Here's the third one. This one is depressing. It's called From Bad to Worse, and it goes like this. So if you watch Breaking Bad, this is that. We have a 3 times a week soap on BBC called EastEnders. Do you get EastEnders out here? It wouldn't travel, no. EastEnders, this is the plot of EastEnders every week. You thought it was bad? No, it's worse by the end of the week. Every week it's worse. Here's the fourth one. I'm not going to tell you the name of this one, but it goes like this. It's rare because there's not much drama in it. It's just telling the story of gradual improvement. I'll give you the title for this one in a minute, but not yet. Again, this one I'm not going to give you the title for. It goes like this. It's going well, and then it's ruined. And the fifth one, I think you'll recognize this one. It starts very low. There's a little girl. She's an orphan. Her dad remarries a nasty lady who's got ugly daughters. But then things get better. Shoes, dress, carriage, dance, things are looking good. But then, bong, 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 it all goes. It's not quite as bad as it had been when she'd started, because she's always got the memory of that wonderful night. But then the prince comes, and it all ends up in infinite happiness. That's Cinderella. Now, let's just go back to those last three that I didn't give you a title. The last three I didn't give you title for. So first of all, this one here. Interesting, remember Kurt Vonnegut is not a Christian. He calls this creation. This one, remember again, he's not a Christian, he calls Old Testament. And Cinderella, well, of course, you could describe that as the Bible. Now, how is a story graph useful to us as preachers? Well, I want you to imagine a story that goes something like this. Mr. Man is married. He's married to somebody who's not a great beauty, but nor is she ugly. They were averagely content for the duration of this whole story. The end. Now, what's the problem with that story? I mean, if you're going to draw that story, it goes something like... What's the problem with that as a story? It's boring. What does it need? Tension. It needs drama. How would you express drama on a story graph? Yeah, change of direction. Exactly. It needs some turning points in it. So when we say a story needs drama, actually what it needs is dips and mountains. It needs twists and turns. It needs turning points. What makes a story is shape. There's some sense of movement. Now, this is very important to us. I don't know whether you'd agree with me, but I think in most of our preaching of Old Testament narrative, we manage to successfully flatten out every story. We lose all the bumps, all the twists and the turns, and we make it one of those. Here are the three truths about God from this story. Now, I think it's helpful to use this tool to help us analyze the structure of stories. Let's take this again, which is Man in a Hole. So you'll notice that what this does actually is divide up into three sections. How it begins, the stuff that happens in the middle, and how it ends up. And you'll see that the vertical blue lines happen at turning points. It's a bit like that chiasm thing we were thinking about. The turning points of the story. Now, you'll notice the blue lines here are the turning points. So what that gives us is 4 points in the story. First of all, we have the introduction. Then we have the crisis or the tension. Then we have the resolution or the turning point. And then we have the conclusion where it all ends up. So just going back through those again, the first thing you've got then is the introduction. What's the baseline starting point? Secondly, what's the crisis? What's the tension point? When does the introduction turn bad and the line go down? Drama is conflict. So what's wrong? Why? What's going to happen? What's in danger? The third is the resolution or the turning point, where the graph starts to take the upward turn. What happens to solve the problem? What's the key point when it turns? And the fourth is where the line ends up. How are we left? Happy or sad? Fully resolved, or is this the beginning of another story? Okay, this is what I want you to do. Daniel 7. Let's turn to Daniel chapter 7. Here's your line. Your graph, your story graph for Daniel 7. Use one of the other blanks you've got in your sheet. With your neighbour, work out a story graph for Daniel 7. And after we've had some time working on this, I'll get some people to come up and show us what they've done. So, story graph, Daniel 7. Go. if you haven't started putting pen to paper, please do that now. Actually draw it on your bit of paper, what you think the story graph would be. Okay, we done? Okay, who'd be willing to come and draw their story graph for me on my board? It's fine, we'll only mock you mercilessly, so there's nothing to fear. Anybody, I'm going to get a couple of people to come and do it. If you don't, somebody doesn't volunteer, I could pick you, and that might be even more. Well done. Good decision. If I was in the group either side of you, I'd be expecting it's going to be me next time. That's good. So if you just talk it through, and I'll say it through the microphone so everybody can hear what you're saying as you draw it. Go.
So we started at the average point, and then we had 4 drops for each of the beasts.
Okay, so average point and then 4 drops for each of the beasts.
A particularly bad drop there,
And a very bad fourth one.
the 4th beast. And then we kind of had, so a lift up here,
A lift up here,
and then a second lift up here.
and then a second lift up.
The first one being the Ancient of Days,
Yes.
and then the second one being one like a son of man.
So the first lift up being the Ancient Days, that's the one at the bottom, and the second one being, the second kind of bump is the Son of Man. Thank you very much. Good. Who'd like to do that next? That was all right, wasn't it? Wasn't that scary? You don't know how many examples we're going to do today. Everybody have to do it. This might be the easy one. Who'd like to go next? Somebody else who'd be willing to go? Oh, I love this. Everybody's avoiding my eye. Well done. Andy, you are the man. Thank you. So just draw it over the top, and we've got a different colour. This is green.
Basically a very similar start.
Oh, okay. All right. Similar start.
So I was a bit confused when we get to, so this is kind of verse 13 and 14 up here.
So 13, 14 is up there.
Crashing down again.
So it's going to come down at 13, 14.
So it's going to come crashing down,
Do you mean 13, 14, or do you mean 15?
maybe, yeah.
Where Daniel is alarmed? Where Daniel is alarmed. Not where the Son of Man comes. You don't think that's a crashing moment, do you? No, fine. Just checking.
And then verse 22.
Yep.
Seems to all be down here again.
So 22 is down at the bottom.
Sorry, I haven't actually got my Bible.
No, it's fine. We don't need the Bible. We've got a drawing.
Then verse 22, it seems to go back up again.
Okay.
So we're up here again.
Yep.
And then it goes crashing down again.
Whoa, okay.
And we get verse 26.
Crashing down to 26.
Verse 26 there again?
Yeah, that's the court sitting in judgment, dominion taken away
Yeah.
from the one who speaks against the Most High.
So,
Yeah,
speaking against-
yeah, good.
Then it go back up again.
Okay. Chase, we've got another board. This could go on a what?
Verse 27 on the high point there.
27 is the kingdom and the greatness of the kingdom being given to the people of the saints of the Most High.
Seems really good. You'd love it to end there.
Yes.
But it doesn't end there. It ends at verse 28.
Good, okay. So that's about a 28-point sermon. That's looking great. Thanks. Thanks, Cindy. Okay, good. Great, thank you.
I was unsure how that fits into here, so I'd love just to kind of finish there.
Yeah, good.
It seems to recapitulate that a bit.
Yeah.
With some of that. I
Yeah,
don't-
thank
so
you.
maybe can explain it to me.
Yeah, good. Anybody else got anything particularly different from any of those that they'd like to say? It's basically all a downhill thing, or anybody else thinking someone's crashing down with the Son of Man? Yes.
I just want to argue for if you trace Daniel's emotional state across the passage, you start at verse 1 neutral, you get to verse 15 and it's not so great, and then by the end it's terrible.
Yes. Helpful. I think that is a good question to raise. What are we tracing here? The emotional state of somebody or the story? I think stick with the story. What is the storyline to which Daniel is reacting? So I think this isn't a science. I just made this up, so do whatever you like with it. This is the way that, now, the helpful thing on this, apart from Andy's, let's just ignore Andy's for a minute, because the point I'm going to say doesn't quite work with Andy's, but going with a sensible diagram, what I want you to notice is if you were to draw in, do you remember we had those blue vertical lines along with the turning points? Where would we end up with those in that? I guess the key things are, we've got something like that kind of a structure, haven't we? Those key turning points. Let me show you how I did the passage. You can tell me why you think this is wrong. So, I think it begins low and goes lower. So I haven't done it by bumps, but by a sliding scale of the four monsters, who I think are getting worse, more vicious and attacking, and it leads down low. Then we get verse 9, I think a key turning point. And I put together the judgment from the Ancient of Days and the one like a son of man being given the kingdom as one upward movement. That ends, verse 14, with his dominion, his kingdom not lasting, his rule, his reign will never fade away. Then there's a kind of a bit of a plateau in my diagram before, I think, another bit up. The interesting thing about this chapter, I think, is we're told in verse 13 and 14 that one like a son of man will have a kingdom that he will never fade away. And then he appears to. Where is the Son of Man in the second half of the chapter? It's a very striking thing, isn't it? Here comes the solution, the upturn in my diagram, if you like, the judgment of the beasts, the destruction of the beasts in verse 11, the high point of the kingdom being taken from them and given to the one whose kingdom will last forever. And we're only halfway through the chapter and he never appears again. And looking closely at the chapter, you'll see that what is remarkable here is verse 18. The saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess it forever and ever. Verse 22, till the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. And most extraordinary of all, verse 27, and the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms and the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. If verse 27 was spoken about Jesus, we'd be very happy with that, wouldn't we? It seems almost blasphemous for the kind of exalted language of verse 27 to be spoken about us. Is that extraordinary? This is one of the reasons I love expositional preaching that looks closely at the text. See, I think We would think, in our system, the story finishes at verse 14, wouldn't we? Here comes Jesus, the solution to it all. Oh my goodness, there's still half a chapter to go, where what it means to talk about the one like the Son of Man having a kingdom forever is explained. What does that look like? Well, it looks like his people sharing his reign with us, with him. So going back to my thing earlier, the chains have been exchanged for crowns. Instead of our function, our experience being, well, look down to verse 7, for example, being devoured and broken in pieces by a monster that is exceedingly strong and one that is stamping all over. Instead of that being our experience, we end verse 27 sharing the reign of King Jesus. Extraordinary. So these are my vertical lines then, and it divides the passage up at those turning points into these sections. Verses 1 to 8, 9 to 14, and 19 to 27. Now, I take Andy's point. It's all a bit more complicated than the second half, and it may be in preaching we would bring out some of the up and down and the lack of understanding, because I think that is significant, that you'd think, da-da, here's the solution, Daniel, the Ancient of Days, and one like a Son of Man reigning forever. And Daniel goes, way, and he goes, what? So there needs to be further explanation of what the reign of King Jesus means for people to be excited by it. What the reign of King Jesus means is you share and reign with him. So I think there is more to say. I think Andy's observation there is helpful. But what that means is I've got these points. Monsters are ruling. Thrones are set up. Verse 15, tell me the truth. So I think what he's saying. And verse 27, where the chapter takes us to at the end. So these are my points then from that structure. That God will end this world's monstrous kingdoms. God will establish Jesus as king forever. We will share the reign of King Jesus. So it looks something like that on my story graph. Now, whether or not you're agreeing with my headings, I'm not at this point saying, isn't that brilliant? Although it is. My point is, do you get the idea of the shape of stories directing what we're teaching from the story, so that we follow through the twists and the turns, the ups and the downs, the feel of the story, rather than, and the tension in the story, rather than reducing it to bland theological points. So stories have shape. Treat stories as stories. Let's do another one. Let's turn to Daniel chapter 3. More familiar story, perhaps this one. Let's do exactly the same thing. Have we got another blank story graph to draw on? Good. So Daniel chapter 3. Let's do exactly the same task again. Okay. Okay, well, let's come back together again. What I want you to do now is... What I'd like you to do now is to draw in your vertical lines. So draw in those blue vertical lines that match the turning points and put a verse number there. Where is the turning point? Put that blue vertical lines in 3 or 4, whatever you've got. Here are 4 ways of saying the same thing over and over again. Stories have got a shape. Stories are stories. Give attention to details when you're preaching stories. Don't lose the story in the sermon. How easily we do that. Here is an outline for Daniel 3 that is terrible. God's people are not afraid. God's people are not alone. God's people are not assassinated. Ba-boom. Okay, let me end a little bit. And 3 A's. Do you like that? Yeah. Okay, let me just end... by taking us through my sermon in Mini on Daniel 3, just to see how I've used all the things that we've been talking about. So what we've been thinking about, the melodic line of Daniel and the purpose of Daniel, and also story graphing, and how all of that has now fed into the final product. So the story graphing hasn't necessarily produced my headings in this case, but all the story graph working has led to this conclusion. So Daniel chapter 3, here's my first thing, that the king who sets up God, which is where the chapter begins. The previous chapter, I'm only giving you this an outline, this isn't a full sermon, you understand. The previous chapter 2 is all about a statue that looks grand and is smashed to pieces. And Nebuchadnezzar says, a statue, now that's a good idea. So he builds one, a very big one. 90 foot tall as 6 London buses in a stack. So it's not subtle. It's a sign of how important he thinks he is, a symbol of his presumption of world dominion. And the statue in his dream in chapter 2 had a head of gold, and now he thinks, me, gold, yeah, cover me, all over. Not just my head, make the whole statue of gold from head to toe. We don't know that it was a statue of him, we just know it was an image, a golden image that somehow linked to him and his gods. But we do know that everybody is to gather there, at least everybody who's anyone, and they're listed again and again in verse 2 and in verse 3. And verse 7 tells us that all peoples, nations, and languages are there to fall down and worship Nebuchadnezzar's toy model. Your Majesty, my Lord Mayor, your Grace, your Excellencies, my Lord, Mr. Sheriff or Sheriffs, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Please get out of your seats and down on your knees. And the band is listed 4 times in verse 5, verse 7, verse 10, verse 15. What instruments made up this band? The flutes and the fiddles, the trumpet and tom-tom, the banjo, bagpipes and bell. It's a tremendous cacophony. Aren't you impressed? Because can I just ask, do you think it's at all possible that all this pomp is actually being mocked for its pomposity? Because the thing is, this entire thing, this statue, we're told, is a setup. The word setup gets used 11 times in this chapter about this statue, as if to make the point. It looks impressive, fearful, it's got all the weight of national government behind it, but it's a farce. Because, of course, chapter 2 has already made it absolutely clear what God does to state-sponsored statues. If only you can see behind the mask, remembering all that God has just revealed in chapter 2, what is his future for national posturing, if only you can see the falsehood and the stupidity of it, if only you can hear heaven laughing their head off at it, well. And so this curious version of musical statues begins. When the music starts, not in this game, you'll notice when the music stops, but when the music starts, the band starts to play. Did I tell you about the flutes and the fiddles, the trumpet and tom-tom, the bagpipes, banjo and bell? They're all there. The crowd gets its collective backside in the air, its noses in the sand, and enjoys job security. And suddenly these 3 men are exposed, 3 men who say no. They stand out on the plain of Dura because they do literally stand out. What are you doing, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? When they play the tune, why aren't you dancing to this city's music? And then the pressure starts, and you can imagine the conversation. You can still keep your private superstitions. Nobody's asking you to deny your God. Nobody minds all that. It's just that in the public square, in the public sphere, there is such a thing as political correctness, and you've got to submit to that. Your Lord and Master isn't asking too much. Just keep your fingers crossed and get on your knees. You're going to buckle under that immense pressure. Will they manage to coerce you? Well, the second thing we see is that this chapter is all about the God who sets up kings and removes them. Because if you look back to chapter 2, verse 21, you'll see that it is God who sets up kings, 2:21. Nebuchadnezzar sets up a statue, but God sets up kings, and that's exactly what he does. And I wonder if chapter 3 follows chapter 2 to make this point. I may be wrong, but here's my theory. Chapter 2 and this story of God's king smashing all the kingdoms of the world, it begs the question, can he do it? Is he allowed to? Is God really entitled to do this? Can he produce a stone cut from a mountain, but not by human hands, that is mighty enough to break all other kingdoms? Can he put his king on the throne? Can he deliver on all that? In fact, can he deliver his people from Babylon and get them back to their land? Can he deliver them from prison chains to royal crowns? Can he? Is he able? And the answer is yes, he can. All the world can see here that he is able to deliver and rescue. For what this story tells us, it is he is stronger than all the might of the world's empires. Because the might of Babylon and the might of the Persian Empire that followed it and the might of every subsequent kingdom, each layer in that dream sequence in chapter 2, each one may set itself against God and his people, their mighty state machinery, directing its brutality against the Lord and against the saints of the Most High. But here God's rescue demonstrates God's rule. His rescue here gives us confidence that he really does rule. Gives us confidence to look ahead to the ultimate rescue. God rules, and his rescue proves that he rules. So look how the story sets it up. Chapter 3, verse 15. Here is the king with the might and power, enough of it to blow your socks off. And he's got all the images and the gods that you might care for to impress the least religious. And whatever you really think of it, you must admit it looks amazing. And yet the thing is, the whole lot still can't deliver you from the king, because this king is more powerful than his statue. Remember, the whole thing is just to put up. Nebuchadnezzar knows he's bigger and better, and his gods are weaker and wetter. But by the end of the chapter, verse 29, Nebuchadnezzar has to come to realize what? That there is no other God who is, look at the word there, able to rescue. See, he says there is no God who can rescue you. And in verse 15, and by the end of the chapter, here is a God who is able to rescue you. Not just that he can rescue, but that he can rescue. He's mighty enough and powerful enough and ruler enough. He is the God of chapter 2, the God of gods and the Lord of kings. But I still don't think we've got to the heart of the reason why we're told chapter 3. Why are we told these stories alongside the chapters telling us that God reigns? Obviously, chapter 3 is a story of rescue. God can deliver his people from the monster rulers who are in charge. He can. But I wonder if these stories are actually about something else. Before we talk about rescue, this chapter tells us what it's like to live in a world of power, where powerful kings and kingdoms, ever more ferociously monstrous, come and go. This is talking about what it's like to be the people of Jerusalem who are living in the city of Babylon. Because you've got the might of Babylon, the might of the Persian Empire that followed it, are all set against God and his people. And in chapter 3, the state has got fire And in chapter 6, the state has got lion's teeth. And these flames and these teeth are set to devour the faithful. So I wonder if before we get to rescue, these chapters are actually about endurance. God's people enduring the roar of the monster anti-God state that is terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. The monster state that is firmly set to persecute the Christian. How do they do? Look down to verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we've no need to answer you in this matter. If it be so, that you'll throw us into the fiery furnace, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. And you notice the three words that begin verse 18. But if not. Look what they've just said beforehand. We believe our God is able to save us. We believe God definitely will save us. But if he doesn't, even if he doesn't, we're not going to serve your gods. They didn't know how this was all going to turn out. And given the extreme heat coming out of the fire in front of them, there's not a lot of room for doubt about how it's going to turn out. They are for it. They're going to die. How could they take such an immense risk? How could they possibly do it? Well, this is how Jesus put it. Don't be afraid of those who want to kill your body. They can do no more to you after that. I'll tell you whom to fear. Fear God, who has the power to kill you and then throw you into hell. He's the one to fear. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are so sure about who God is. They know who really rules, and that they know who they should really fear. They believed, in other words, all the dreams and visions that God gave them. They lived in this world holding firm to the stuff that God had told them from another world. They faced the Babylonian court confident of what God spoke to them from the heavenly court. John Piper wrote a little book called Risk is Right, and he quoted this verse. And what he basically said is, it's right to risk everything if you're confident you've got a winning hand. But of course, it's not a risk if you know the God behind the scenes. If you had a glimpse behind the curtain, and you know what the Lord of Kings is like, and you know, chapter 2, about this wrecking rock that is to come rolling down the hill, and you know about the judgment thrones of Daniel 7, and about the eternal reign of the Son of Man, and you know that with him the saints of the Most High will reign, if you know all that, well, flames, bring them on. So a while ago, and I'll finish with this, I read the story of a Romanian pastor. He was persecuted for his faith in Romania under the Ceausescu regime. And this is what he wrote. The greatest threat they have is the power to kill you. Our greatest victory is to die. So whenever my persecutors told me we're going to kill you, I said, I can hardly wait. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, isn't it? Bring it on. I don't mind dying. Confident in my God. And nothing you can do is going to make me change from being his and serving him. So death holds no terrors, no fears, no unknowns for us. Death, well, doesn't matter. That's fine. We're going to be with Jesus. So living in this world, holding firm to the reality that God has revealed. And that, I think, is the message of Daniel.